but more importantly to the treatment of ADHD symptoms, you are activating the prefrontal cortex. These drugs for the treatment of ADHD are indeed stimulants, but the answer is that the hyperactivity, impulsivity, and focus issues present in ADHD in children and adults are the consequence not necessarily of deficient activity of neural circuits in the prefrontal cortex, or deficient activity of the default mode network, or deficient activity of the salience network, etc. What appears to be the case, based on a lot of high-quality neuroimaging data, is that the brains of children and adults with ADHD have all of these networks functioning, but those networks are actually hyper-connected. That is, they tend to be coactive at times when ordinarily, meaning in kids and adults without ADHD, they would not be coactive. So that's an important point, because it's easy to get the impression that ADHD is just a deficiency in dopamine and norepinephrine, and that's simply not the case. If you recall, dopamine and norepinephrine are neuromodulators. They modulate the activity of other neural circuits, and they can both increase and decrease activity within those circuits. So you don't necessarily want to think about dopamine and norepinephrine just as molecules that increase neural activity. And you certainly don't want to think about ADHD as just a deficiency in dopamine or a deficiency in norepinephrine. The way these drugs work when they are used effectively to treat ADHD is to tune the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine that are present in particular brain networks in order to allow the person to arrive at just the right balance between the activation of these different neural circuits, causing them largely to be less synchronous in their firing. So this takes us back to this question of why giving stimulants to a kid would calm them down. It's not so much that you're giving a stimulant to a kid to place them into a state of calm. I think that's a common misconception. Rather, by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine, these drugs, yes, increase levels of overall autonomic arousal. They are, after all, sympathomimetics. But more importantly, to the treatment of ADHD symptoms, you are activating the prefrontal cortex in a way that allows it to be more of a coordinator of that orchestra conductor, or if you prefer the analogy to a teacher in the classroom, to ramp up the activity of certain neural circuits in a given moment and quiet down the activity of other neural circuits, such that the default mode network can still perform its incredible actions. After all, the default mode network is involved not just in self-referencing and kind of daydreaming, but also creativity and imagination. That's been well described in the literature, as well as the salience network and these other networks that are designed to drop us into very narrow trenches of attention. These drugs for the treatment of ADHD are indeed stimulants, but the goal of prescribing these drugs to a child or adult with ADHD is to adjust dosage, timing, and the duration over which somebody takes it in their lifespan in order to allow those neural circuits to work in the proper way, meaning for the conductor to activate the instruments in that little symphony or band in the appropriate order in order to arrive at the right music, as opposed to all the instruments playing at once, which would just be complete noise. Or if you prefer the classroom teaching analogy, for the teacher to call on one student while the others are quiet, and then to call on a different student, have one student return to their seats, to have the students work in small groups. Again, all of this by analogy. The point being that dopamine and norepinephrine are all allowing these networks to be activated to the precisely correct levels and in the precisely correct sequence.